Ask most Christians what they think about the controversial subject of taxation, and I bet you'll hear them quote the words of the Lord Jesus when he says, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's." The problem is the verse doesn't stop there, but a lot of times they stop there. So let me ask the question, what did Jesus really mean by that statement? Is he implying that we should just suck it up and pay taxes? Are we quoting this out of context? Is there something deeper going on here? Maybe something we're missing? Jesus has a lot of deep teachings on a lot of important topics, but it seems like we just go surface when he talks about taxes. So let's do a little bit of a journey into this story and get the context. The Pharisees gathered together to conspire. Yeah, that's right. There was a conspiracy going on here around the issue of Jesus, and they wanted to catch him in his words. And what better way to catch somebody in their words, to back them in a corner, than to ask them the question, should we pay taxes or not? So that's exactly what they did. The Pharisees sent some of their disciples to do their dirty work. And they asked Jesus, "Tell us then, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Matthew chapter 22, verse 17. Now we need to understand this was a gotcha question. If Jesus answered yes, the Jews would be upset. How could you tell us to pay taxes to Caesar? How could you say it's lawful to pay taxes to a pagan overlord? If Jesus were to say no, then the Pharisees can simply go to the Romans and say, hey, look at this Jesus of Nazareth. He's telling people not to give tribute, not to pay taxes to Caesar. Now the Romans would be upset. He's in between a rock and a hard place. So what does Jesus do? Well, Jesus was well aware of their malice in asking the question, and he calls them hypocrites. He says, "Show me the coin, you hypocrites," for the tax. So they fished around in their pockets and they gave him a denarius, which was a day's wage for a laborer. He then asked them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" Showing them the coin in Matthew 22, verse 20. They answered, "Well, it's Caesar's likeness and inscription." Then Jesus says the famous line, which every Christian loves to quote when it comes to taxes. Therefore, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Matthew 22:21. That last part often gets left out. Give to God, render to God what is God's. Now, a surface reading would lead you to think that Jesus just told them to pay their taxes in a way that wouldn't upset the Jews or wouldn't upset the Romans. But I think this understanding is a tad bit lacking and really leads to more questions than answers. Now, look, if Jesus did tell them to just pay the tax and that's all he meant by this phrase, why did the disciples of the Pharisees marvel at his words? I mean, what was so marvelous about Jesus just telling them, give to Caesar what is his and to God what is his? What was so clever about this? What was so awe inspiring about this statement? Was it just because Jesus was being clever? Is that why they marveled? Or again, is there something we're missing in between the lines here? Now, there's a lot going on in this story and a lot of questions that need to be answered. What is the biblical view of taxation? What is the history of the Israelites with taxation up till now? Who is Caesar? Why is his image on the coin? And most importantly, what belongs to God? And on we could go. First, we need to have a fundamental understanding of how Jesus understood the nature of human beings. Genesis 1:26 says, then God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. Genesis 1:26. Human beings are made in God's image and likeness. Now, what does that mean? Well, God tells us in the next few verses to be made in God's image and likeness is to be given dominion of creation. We, as God's imagers, are mandated to rule and reign over what God has made. We are his image in creation, meaning we do what God does on a micro scale. We take the earth, we subdue it, we bring it into subjection, we take the chaos of nature and we bring it into order for God's glory. We're basically God's royal stewards over his world, over his creation. It's what we were made to do. We take dominion of the earth several ways. One, in maybe the best way, is by being fruitful and multiplying. God created this place, this earth for us in order to multiply his image. We're tasked to fill the earth with his image. And as we do, our job is to collaborate together with all the imagers that have been created now to make the earth a place teeming with life and innovation, in progress, in order, and goodness. But there's one important thing to mention here. Our royal stewardship was to be done under the kingship of God. Now, while Adam and Eve were in the garden, they were free. Key word. As soon as they forsook the Lord and disobeyed him, opting instead for their knowledge of good and evil, well, getting the knowledge of good and evil their own way, rather, they became slaves and were booted out of God's presence. But it wouldn't stay that way because God promised a seed to come from the woman who would stomp on the serpent's head. What's God promising here? He's promising to come and repair the brokenness and restore the Edenic mandate and mission. Remember that word freedom. That's going to be key going forward here. So fast forward to the nation of Israel. God has chosen them and saved them from Egypt, and now they're in the land that God promised them, but they had no king, no earthly king, rather. God was their king, and he ruled over them through prophets and through judges. Now, eventually the people rose up and they asked the prophet Samuel to inquire of God and give them a king like the nations have. Samuel's sons were degenerates, and the people didn't want them ruling over them since Samuel was getting old. So they said, Samuel, give us a king. But this displeased the prophet, and he inquired of God. And God assured him, look, Samuel, they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me as being king over them. So the Lord told Samuel to grant them a king, but to warn them what the king would be like. Now, the final thing God says about this earthly king is this. He says, he will take the 10th of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 17 and 18. Now, did you catch that? He will take the 10th, and you shall be his slaves. God warns the people that an earthly king would tax them and would thereby make them slaves. Remember that word, free. They were no longer free. They would regret this decision and they would call out to God, but God says, I'm going to ignore your pleas in that day. Why? Because they chose a man to rule over them. They did not choose freedom. Fast forward a bit more, and we see this king that Samuel chose for them, named Saul, rather, who God chose, ruling over the people of Israel. And as they went to war with the Philistines, a giant named Goliath rose up to challenge them. Now, the whole army of Israel was terrified, and nobody would dare fight Goliath. So the king issued a reward to incentivize the men to fight and to kill this giant, Goliath. We all know the story. But we miss this part here. Look at this. Look at the reward. It says, the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. There's that word again. Make his father's house free in Israel. That's found in 1 Samuel 17:25. The king promised riches, his daughter in marriage, and freedom. But wait a minute. Weren't the men of Israel living in Israel already free? Well, apparently not. They paid taxes to the king. They were slaves of the king. Everyone knew it, which is why no one stopped and said, hey, king, what do you mean we will be free? Who are we slaves to? It was well known what was meant by this term. It meant their father's house would be tax exempt. Very important going forward. Now, fast forward to Jesus. Tax collectors asked Peter whether Jesus pays the 2 drachma tax or not. And Peter says, yeah, yeah, of course, of course. But when Peter goes into Jesus, Jesus asks him a question. He says, what do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others? That's in Matthew 17:25. And Peter said, from others. Then Jesus said in Matthew 17:26, then the sons are free. Then the sons are free. There's that word again, free. Why was the man who killed Goliath tax exempt? Because he would get the king's daughter in marriage, which would make him the king's son, which would make him free, not a slave. Jesus then tells Peter to go pull a fish from the water and that he would find a coin in its mouth and it would be enough to pay for the tax. Why? Because taxation is good and we should pay it? No, so as to, as Jesus said, not cause offense. And Jesus was basically saying the trouble of not paying it in this instance is not worth it. Just pay the tax. And here's where the money is. Give to God what is God's. Okay, now let's try to bring this all together. Jesus asked the Pharisees whose image and likeness was on the coin. Let's ask the same question about what we ought to render to God. Where in creation can we find God's image and likeness? Now think about it. It's on you and on me, right? We are made in God's image. We are made in his likeness. So what are we to render to God? Ourselves, our whole selves. So then what was Jesus's point? Think back on what God said to Israel about desiring a king. What would the king do? He would tax you and make you his slaves. Jesus was reminding them that they were getting exactly what they asked for. They wanted to be ruled by men. They didn't want freedom. They chose an earthly king, a man, to rule them. And now they're ruled by men, albeit not an Israelite like them, a pagan man, a ungodly man, but a man nonetheless. This is what they asked for. So what is the way out of this tax slavery? Is it not to pay taxes? No. The way out is to render to God what is God's. It's to not be a hypocrite. It's to not say, I want God as king. Jesus is Lord. He's my king. It's not being a hypocrite like the Pharisees and saying, yes, God is our king, but then asking for an earthly king or trying to trip up someone in his words by asking them about taxation. You see the hypocrisy in that? We need to render to God that which is God's. The point Jesus was making was not pay taxes. Taxes are great. Caesar's awesome. No, he was reminding them and us that we've missed the plots. Why were they under the oppressive rule of Rome and Caesar? Why weren't they sovereign in the land God promised them? Because they rejected God and they were under judgment. Oppressive pagan taxation was only a symptom of the greater problem they failed to see, their lack of devotion and love for God. This is why they marveled at his words, because they all knew he was calling them out. For us, this may seem like a stretch, but remember, these were disciples of Pharisees. They were steeped in the biblical worldview. And as soon as Jesus connected the image and likeness of Caesar to his statement to give him what was his, they knew they were finished. They knew with that statement, Jesus was exposing them as hypocrites who had rejected God with their very question. Now, why ask about taxes? Didn't they know why taxation was a thing? Of course they knew. They knew it. They knew it was because they rejected God as king over them. They were familiar with 1 Samuel chapter 8. So why try to entrap Jesus with a question that presupposes their own rejection of God? Because in their blind hatred for the Lord, they were unable to see their own rejection of God, and they marveled at how easily Jesus was able to see through their own hypocrisy and expose them. After all, Jesus did call them hypocrites. Remember, he called them hypocrites for asking the question, why? How were they being hypocritical by asking if they should pay taxes? It's not a hypocritical question, is it? In this case, it was because in the question, they tried to entrap him despite their tax dilemma being their own doing for rejecting God and not doing the will of the Lord. The irony in this whole encounter is that the one they were questioning was the one their forefathers rejected as being king over them. Had they not rejected him, had they desired God to be king over them, Caesar would not be burdening them with taxes and they would be free. The sons are free. Therefore, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's.